There are, thank you, Sinette, captions enabled if you'd like to see the transcript as you go. And I'm just going to move my meeting recorded bar so that I can see everybody again. We will be using the chat today, and there are planned discussion breaks throughout our time together. So during that time, you are welcome to use the chat. If you would like to use your voice to interact, we would just ask that you raise a virtual hand. So to be able to do that, if you scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom bar and click the React button, there's a raised hand function. And the reason I ask you to do it that way versus raising a physical hand is it will pop you to the top of the screen where we're then able to see that you have a hand raised. Otherwise, not everybody is visible to either myself or the presenter at the same time. If we miss a hand or you don't get something into the chat, feel free to unmute. It sounds a bit formal when we go through all of this at the start, but we're generally in group. There we go. It does say please hold questions until after the presentation. Because we have those breakout, or not breakout rooms, but breakout discussion times, if there's questions that you'd like to pose to Amanda during that time, I think that's also welcome, and we'll have time together at the end. I saw a hand and it disappeared. Maybe we're trying it out. If you would like to rename yourself and participate anonymously, that's an option for you as well. The instructions for that are at the last bullet on this slide. Okay, so before I jump into everything, actually, Sinette, do you want to go back one slide? I'll just do the agenda for today. There we go. So my name's Michelle Phoenix. I've had the very lucky opportunity to meet many people on this call before. I'm one of the members of the Equity-Based Co-Creation Center. Several of our members are on the call, and Sinette, who you've heard me refer to, has done an incredible job pulling together today's content and session and will help to moderate. So thank you so much for that, Sinette. I'm going to share a brief land acknowledgement and introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. I did mention that we are going to have several questions presented almost as discussion topics. So there'll be 3 of those with breaks between each. We'll have time for an open discussion and just some closing remarks from our co-design team. Thanks, Annette. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amanda Sim, and I'm going to pull up her bio just because it's so impressive and I don't want to forget any details. So Dr. Amanda Sim is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience and the Mary Hersink Global Health Program, and a core member of the Offred Center for Child Studies at McMaster University. Dr. Sim's research focuses on the mental health and well-being of children and families affected by war and forced displacement. She conducts equity-focused, community-engaged research to understand the needs of refugee and other marginalized families in Canada and globally, with the goal of co-creating and testing interventions to improve child and family outcomes. Dr. Sim holds a doctorate in social intervention from the University of Oxford and previously worked at the International Rescue Committee implementing and evaluating violence prevention and mental health interventions in countries including Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Lebanon. So the title of the talk today, and I hope you know and you've all registered to be here, is Navigating Tensions in Co-Creation with Culturally Diverse Communities. Before we roll into that, and I've had a chance to introduce myself and to introduce our guest speaker, we'd love to know a little bit more about everybody who's here with us on the call. So or maybe just after I do a land acknowledgement, if you don't mind also sharing who you are in the chat, you're welcome to share where you're joining from. If you'd like to share an organization that you work with or for, we're happy to sort of get to know everybody a little bit as we move through today's talk. So I invite you to do that in the chat, and it'd be wonderful to get to know you all. I will also share that McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And that might be a familiar land acknowledgement to many of us who are here at McMaster University, but for every talk or every time I prepare a land acknowledgement, I also try to think about the context we are speaking about. Thanks. And so for today's talk, I picked out a quote that I found particularly meaningful. I'm going to pull it up one more time. It's from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And this part of the story I really loved. It said the trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. Exactly how they do this, we don't know yet. But what we see is the power of unity. What happens to one happens to us all. We can starve together or feast together. And as we come together as a co-design community here, I like to think about the collective action and our collective learning and what we create together that's different than what any one of us could create on our own. So I hope we can take that idea into today's talk. Sinette, I think you have one announcement to do prior to us rolling into the content.
Yes. Sorry, there's some feedback. Okay, I hope that my audio sounds better now. So the Equity-Based Co-Creation Hub is so excited to announce that we are having a seed grant competition for students from undergraduate or graduate levels, and applications will be opening today at 12 p.m. and will be due in February 28th of next year. So if you are interested, please take a look at that, and you're able to access the application package using this QR code. And I will also post the link in the chat. So please share with your network, and we're really excited to see your applications. And we also have a brief announcement. Jillian, I don't know if you want to speak to this briefly before we get into the talk for today.
Sure, that would be great. Thanks, Sinette. Yeah, we're really, really excited to let people know that we have an opportunity to apply for a SSHRC partnership grant. And the goal of this grant is to create a national network of equity-based co-creation centers or hubs to advance the research and practice of co-creation to make the work particularly in public services, more accessible to equity deserving groups. We think a national network would be really beneficial at this time. You know, we try to share as much as we can, but we think there's lots of people doing excellent work in a number of centers. They may not call it equity-based co-creation, but are following the principles and practices, and there's so much we can learn from each other. And with the community partners and ecosystems for innovation that are going on across the country. So this is a two-phase grant. We start with phase one that goes in February 10th. And our first internal deadline is January 6th here at McMaster. So we thought today was a great opportunity to let people know we're looking for people who want to partner on this. And even if you just have questions and you want to reach out, there's a link here and a QR code. I think Sinette will put the link in the chat for everyone. And it's just a very brief questionnaire to find out who you are, why you're interested, what kind of work you're doing, and how this would be beneficial for you. And we'll get back to you in due course. We'd love to hear from everybody week by week from today. I hope that gives everyone enough chance to at least signal interest, and we can go from there. So I think the benefits of this is that everyone can share the great work they're doing, share resources, help to develop, just to have a greater collective impact and a forum for sharing at a national level that can help amplify the good work that everyone's doing. So yeah, please consider. And we can take questions at the end, but I don't want to hold up the webinar at this point, but let's get moving forward.
Thank you, Jillian. At this point, I would invite Dr. Amanda Sim to please share your slides. Perfect.
Sorry, everyone. I was just having a bit of trouble unmuting myself. Can everyone see my slide okay? Excellent, great. Well, thank you so much to the co-design team for inviting me to speak at this webinar this morning. And thank you to everyone for taking time out of your Thursday morning to join us. And thanks for the lovely introduction. So as Michelle mentioned, I am an assistant professor at McMaster. Before coming to McMaster, I I had a whole other career working for an international NGO called the International Rescue Committee, where I spent many years living and working in countries in Africa and Asia with refugee and other war-affected communities. So that's my background. I started off in research as well as in program implementation. And that experience really informs all of my work to this day. My research is very much applied, working with war-affected communities and other communities affected by global adversity, both here in Canada with refugees who have resettled to Hamilton, as well as communities in the global south, primarily in Asia. And my work is very much focused around co-creating interventions with children and families to promote positive parenting, reduce family violence, and improve child and family well-being. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. In terms of today's talk, this is not going to be a traditional academic talk. I just wanted to have this opportunity to share my own experiences as someone who is relatively early on in my career as a PhD researcher, and share a little bit about some of the challenges as well as rewards that I've experienced doing this kind of work. I certainly don't have all of the answers, and I'm learning how to navigate these tensions every day. So I'm hoping that we can use this webinar as an opportunity for us to share and discuss the tensions that we face in doing co-creation, especially with culturally diverse communities in different settings, and really share and brainstorm together what strategies we've used to address and navigate these tensions. So what I'm going to do is first talk a little bit about two projects that I work on that involve co-creation. And these will serve as the context and background to some of the tensions that I'll be speaking about. So I'll talk about my experience and give some examples from these projects, and then pause and invite questions and discussion and just feedback from everyone on the webinar. And then we'll wrap up with some reflections that I've gathered and lessons learned over the years. And then we'll open up to a general discussion and question and answer period, where we can talk about maybe other challenges or tensions that folks have experienced and how you've navigated them. So these are the two projects that I'm primarily going to be talking about today and drawing examples from to talk about these tensions. So as I've mentioned, I work across both local and global contexts. Thriving Together is a community-engaged research program that I started since 2020 here in Hamilton. And the goal of that research program is to partner with refugee families as well as newcomer service providers from a variety of sectors, so education, health, settlement, and so forth, to really understand from the perspectives of families themselves and from those who serve them, what are the mental health needs that newcomer children and families have? What barriers do they experience when trying to access support? And also, what preferences do they have for the types of mental health support that they would like to receive? So this work has been going on since 2020, and we're now also embarking on a 3-year co-design process where we'll be working with families and with service providers to co-create an intervention to promote positive mental health and well-being among refugee families, taking a lot of what they've told us from the last 4 years of work and then trying to address those needs and priorities through this co-creation process. And then also evaluating the intervention to see if it's feasible, acceptable, and ultimately effective. So that's the work that I do with refugee families who are now living here in Hamilton. And I also have a project that's been going on for the last 3 or 4 years on the Thailand-Myanmar border, which we call the Parenting on the Border project. And this again is an academic community partnership with the goal of co-creating and testing strategies to reduce violence against children in the home and to promote child and family well-being in a very in a very marginalized population of families who have been displaced across the border from Myanmar into Thailand and living in conditions of extreme adversity. This project has been going on since 2022, but I have a long history with this border context. I was born in Thailand, first of all, but I also lived and worked there about 12 years ago in this exact setting where I was working for this NGO to deliver and evaluate parenting programs. So I have a long history with this context and with this community. And in our current project, we have co-created and tested 2 interventions where we use media and arts-based strategies to illustrate the parenting challenges that families on the border experience, and also what are some strategies that parents and families can use to cope with mental health stressors, cope with parenting challenges, and promote child and family well-being. So we worked with local partners to co-create a narrative film called Being Family, which was entirely co-designed with and by refugee and migrant families living on the border. So the person who wrote the script for the film is a refugee. All of the camera operators, the light operators were refugees and migrants. And everyone in the film who acted in the film were just regular community people living on the border who contributed their talents to creating this film with us, which we then tested in an evaluation after screening it to over 1,000 families and found really positive impacts on promoting positive parenting and reducing violence against children. So we were really excited about that. And based on that, co-created a second intervention to address some of the more specific mental health challenges among caregivers, many of whom have experienced high levels of trauma and adversity. And so we took the film and also created short videos where we incorporated clips from the film and added voiceover and animation to illustrate some mental health coping strategies. So I'm going to show you, just give you a little bit of a taster of the kind of work that we've co-created with families in this project, just so you get a sense of what we've been able to do by using these co-creation strategies.
一对ရှိကျမတို့အားလုံးမှာအဆိုးမြင်စိတ်တွေနဲ့ခံစားချက်တွေရှိကြပါတယ်ကျမတို့ရဲ့အတွေ့အတွေခံစားချက်တွေဒါမှမဟုတ်အမတ်ရမှုတွေကကျမတို့ကိုချိန်နဲ့ညှိတွယ်သလိုမျိုးညှိတွယ်နိုင်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါတွေကကျမတို့မလုပ်ချင်တဲ့အရာတွေကိုလုပ်ခိုင်းတတ်ပါတယ်ကျမတို့ရဲ့တမိုးထားမှုအပေါ်ကျမတို့လိုက်လုပ်ချင်ကြပြီမဲ့လေဒီလိုညှိတွယ်မှုတွေရှိခဲ့ရင်ကျမတို့မလုပ်နိုင်တော့ပါဘူးအဲ့ဒါကိုညှိတွယ်ခြင်းလို့ခေါ်တယ်ရုပ်ရှင်ထဲမှာညှိတွယ်ခြင်းနဲ့ပတ်သက်တဲ့ဥပမာများစွာကိုကျမတို့တွေ့ခဲ့ရပြီးပဲဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒေါ်သားဆိုတဲ့ဂျိတ်ကညီညီရဲ့အမေကိုညှိတွယ်ခဲ့ပြီးတော့ညီညီကိုကျွဲလို့ခေါ်လိုက်တယ်
စိုးရင်ပူပန်မှုနဲ့ညှို့ချက်ကင်းမဲ့ခြင်းဆိုတဲ့ဂျိတ်ကညီညီရဲ့ဖေကိုညှိတွယ်ပြီးရဲတောက်တာမူဗီအိမ်ပြန်လာတာဖြစ်ခဲ့တယ်ကျောင်းဝင်ခြင်းနဲ့ဒေါ်လာဆိုတဲ့ဂျိတ်ကညီညီရဲ့အမေကိုညှိတွယ်ခဲ့ပြီးတော့ဟဲ့ခွေးမဘယ်ချိန်ရှိနေပြီလဲလို့သူ့ရဲ့အမေကပြောခဲ့တယ်
မင်းဆိုလိုချင်တာသူတို့နဲ့ကိုနေစားအလုပ်ပဲခိုင်းမယ်ပေါ့ငါစိတ်ဖြစ်နေတဲ့ရှစ်လစာကြောက်ချုပ်တာလို့ထင်နေတာ
ဟုတ်တယ်သူတို့အဲ့လိုပြောခဲ့ရမယ်ဒါပေမဲ့သူတို့ကမနေ့ပြန်ကြားလို့ရှိရင်အားကတော့ဆင်းပြန်မလို့ဘူးလို့ပြောနေ
ဒါဆိုငါတို့ဘယ်လိုစီစဉ်ကြမလဲနင်းနဲ့လုံးလုံးနေရမှာဖြစ်မှာလေကလေးတွေအတွက်ကြောင်းမစုံအစ်စ်တွေကလိုနေပြီအမေသမီးလွယ်ကဟောင်းနေပြေးလဲပြေးနေအမေပြောအစ်စ်ဝယ်ပြီးမယ်ဆိုပြိတ်လည်းဝယ်ပြီးသေးဘူးကျောင်းမှာသမီးတက်ငယ်ချင်းတွေကလွယ်အစ်စ်ကိုစီနဲ့အမေတောင်းဝကြောင်းတော့ပြေးဝယ်ပြီးမယ်ဆို
ဟဲ့ငါတို့လူရှင်တော်ပဲပူစာနေကြတယ်ငါတို့မှပတ်ချောင်ဘယ်လိုခက်ခက်ခရရှာဆိုငါတို့သိလားဒီလောက်ကိုရုံးလုံးနေတာတော့မှစောက်ဖို့နိုင်တယ်အသက်ဝေပေးလိုက်အောင်လေငါမှအပုံဝင်မရှိဘူးငါတို့လူရှင်သမျှအခုချက်ဝေပေးလိုက်အောင်လေငါတို့မိဘတွေကတစ်ထစ်မဟုတ်ဘူးအဲ့ရဲ့ရှင်တွေလေးသိကြအောင်လေငါတို့ကတူတူကျေးဇူးမသိကြတဲ့ကလေးတွေပဲ
စင်ရဲ့ဖေကသူ့အလုံးနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးစိုးရင်ပူပန်မှုတွေဝမ်းနည်းမှုတွေရှက်ရွံ့မှုတွေစားတဲ့ဂျိတ်တွေညှိတွယ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်မကောင်းတဲ့အပြတ်သဘောဆောင်တဲ့အတွေ့အကြုံတွေလည်းညှိတွယ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်မိသားစုကိုထောက်ပံ့နိုင်တဲ့အဖေဆိုးပဲဆိုရဲမကောင်းတဲ့အစိုးမြင်အတွေ့အကြုံတွေလည်းညှိတွယ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်စိုးရင်ပူပန်မှုတွေနဲ့အစိုးမြင်အတွေ့အကြုံညှိတွယ်ခံရတဲ့အခါဘာတွေဖြစ်သွားခဲ့လဲသူကဒေါသကိုမထိန်နိုင်မဲ့ကလေးတွေကိုပြင်းပြင်းထန်ထန်အော်ငေါက်ခဲ့တယ်သူအဲ့လိုပုံစံမျိုးနဲ့တုံ့ပြန်ခြင်းတယ်လို့ထင်ပါလား
ဟာမထင်ပါဘူးသူကတကယ်တော့ကျင်နာပြီးကြီးဆိုင်တတ်တဲ့မိဘမျိုးဖြစ်ကောင်းဖြစ်ချင်လိမ့်မယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အတွင်းရဲ့ခံစားချက်တွေကအရန်ကိုပြင်းထန်ပြီးတော့သူ့ကိုချိတ်ဆွဲထားတာကြောင့်သူ့ရဲ့တမိုးချမှုတွေကိုမလုံနိုင်အောင်ဟန်တားစေခဲ့ပါတယ်
Okay, so that was just a small taster of the kind of work that we've been co-creating with communities on the Thailand-Myanmar border. And I'm happy to talk more about that project if anyone has any questions later. But I did want to get to the topic of today's webinar, which is around navigating tensions in co-creation. Obviously, I firmly believe that co-creation is incredibly important and valuable, especially when working in diverse cultural contexts and with culturally diverse communities, because it helps us to increase relevance, feasibility, and of course also ultimately effectiveness of the interventions and programs that we co-create. However, it comes with its challenges, and I wanted to talk today about some of the tensions that I personally have experienced as someone, again, who's an early career researcher who works on developing and testing interventions, often in communities where I come in as an outsider. And I'm going to be talking about 3 different tensions today. I'll talk about each one and share some examples and experiences that I've had And then I'll pause and just open it up to any questions or reflections on that particular tension before moving on to the next one. Oh, and I just realized that I forgot to mention in the beginning the artwork. I haven't talked about the artwork, have I? So I meant to say that all of the beautiful artwork on these slides were actually created by newcomer families who participated in our Thriving Together project in Hamilton. So as part of our knowledge translation strategy, we conducted art workshops with the participants in our study where we gave them a canvas, which consisted of a map of Hamilton, and asked them to use art to reflect on their journeys to Hamilton and also on the findings of the study that they all took part in. And then the art workshops were fantastic. Children and parents were working together to create these beautiful maps, which we then showcased in a public art exhibit that we held at Hamilton City Hall. So all of the artwork that you see on these slides were created by refugee children and parents in our study. Okay, so let's move to the first tension of practicing the science of co-creation, what to do when worldviews collide. And I wanted to talk about two specific examples of this. One, which I'm calling the clash of civilizations question mark. You'll note that in my slides, I'm using a lot of quotation marks and question marks because I'm interrogating and questioning a lot of these ideas. And so, the clash of civilizations is, as many of you know, this idea that there are these really diverse cultural values that are inherently and fundamentally in opposition to one another. And so one example of that is around the use of violence against children in the context of discipline. And this is work that I do. I work on interventions to reduce violence against children in the home, which often takes place in the context of discipline. And I work on interventions to encourage parents to use alternative forms of discipline that don't involve violence. Now, I typically do this work in communities and settings where the use of violence against children is highly normative. So in our project on the Thailand-Myanmar border, when we conducted a survey of over 2,000 parents and caregivers, about half agreed that it was necessary to use physical punishment in order to raise their children well. So as someone coming into this setting as an outsider who firmly believes that the use of violence against children is not only wrong, but also ineffective, and there's a lot of evidence to show that there are harmful impacts of harsh punishment on children's development as well into adolescence and adulthood. It's an interesting challenge to kind of go into a setting and into a community that has strongly held beliefs around how they should parent and bring up their children well, and to come into that setting trying to essentially change minds. Now, what I've and when I began this kind of work, close to 20 years ago, at the time, a lot of NGOs, a lot of implementing organizations in these settings were doing what we call community sensitization or awareness raising, where you go in and you basically tell parents that using violence against children is wrong, it's bad for children, and that they should not do it. And we did not find those strategies very effective, as you can imagine. And a lot of parents actually were quite resistant, and we encountered a strong backlash of parents saying, well, don't come here and tell me how to parent my own children. And so what we've done in our work is to really try and find an opening that makes sense and that resonates with parents and families. And in our project on the border, we started out with very extensive qualitative research where we spoke with families, parents, and children to understand what are those strategies that they currently use to discipline children. Why did they think that those strategies were important? Why did they use those strategies? And also whether they felt that those strategies were effective. And really interestingly, what we heard from our qualitative research is that parents and caregivers said, yes, I do hit my children. I think it's important for children to learn and grow up well, and that's why I do it. However, it causes me a great deal of pain when I have to discipline my children that way. Every parent that we spoke with in our qualitative work spoke a lot about how it hurts them more than it hurts their children to use physical punishment. And they expressed a great deal of distress about having to use physical punishment. And so that was our opening. We used that as an opening to talk about physical punishment and how it comes from a place of parents wanting to do the best for their children, but it has these negative impacts, not only for the parent, which they themselves mentioned, it was very distressing for them to have to do this, but also it had a negative impact on the relationship between the parent and child. And then we started to introduce the idea that and the scientific evidence around negative impacts on children's outcomes. So starting out with that qualitative research enabled us to come to this tension, this potential, clash in values. It enabled us to come to it from a place of empathy, saying we empathize with parents wanting to do the best that they can for their children, wanting to bring up their children well. And we empathize with how difficult it is to do that in this setting. And we empathize with how using physical forms of punishment is actually really difficult and hard and causes pain to parents as well as to children. And that enabled us to create a space to talk about something that could potentially be quite sensitive and challenging in this community in a way that was acceptable. So that's kind of one example of how we navigated that tension around a difference in cultural values and beliefs. The other tension I wanted to briefly talk about is this idea of marrying art and science, which is essentially what we did in co-creating that film, which I showed you parts of in that little video earlier. So when we created this film, obviously I am not a filmmaker, so we partnered with filmmakers living on the border, this wonderful organization called Sapanya Foundation that creates educational films with refugees and migrants living on the border. So here we were, two teams, myself coming from a research background, trained to design and deliver evidence-based parenting interventions in a very specific way, where there are X number of sessions. You learn skill number 1 in session 1. You learn skill number 2 in session 2. It's all very structured. It's in a manual. You follow it step by step. And then we were working with artists, essentially, filmmakers, who do not at all think about this in a linear way, who don't really know anything about parenting interventions, but who know everything there is to know about co-creating films in this community. And it was a real exercise of learning from each other about our respective disciplines and also our very different ways of looking at the world and at this work, where our training and our background and our kind of philosophies were extremely different. And we had to find a way to merge art and science to co-create this film together. And it took many, many months and hours-long conversations, and I think about 12 versions of writing this script together. And, making a lot of compromises around how we wanted to depict these parenting challenges and skills. And I think for me, it really involved taking a leap of faith and jumping into the unknown. For those of you who do research, I think you'll appreciate that, in research, you want everything to be written down and you want everything to be structured and figured out from the start, right? You're often told you write a study, you design a study, you write a protocol, you figure out all your methods and your steps. And I wasn't able to do that with co-creating this film with this partner. I really had to take a leap of faith and say, I don't know what this end product is going to look like. I don't know what this film is going to look like. They couldn't show me a rough cut of it. I had no sense of what the finished product would be, but I had to take a leap of faith and say, I trust you. You're my partner in this. I trust that you know what you're doing. And to basically leap into the unknown based on that trust as the foundation. And thankfully, it worked out extremely well. But I think it's sort of an example of how, again, when trying to do, especially do arts-based work with communities, a lot of it is about learning how different people might approach the work very differently based on their backgrounds, but also just being willing to take that leap of faith into the unknown because not everything is going to be decided upfront. So I'll just take a quick pause here and see if there are any reflections or questions around this first tension of, worldviews colliding, potentially tensions between how different cultures might approach a particular issue, or how different sectors or disciplines might approach working together.
Amanda, I'll just remind people that you're welcome to enter your ideas into the chat and I can read those out loud for the group, or if you'd prefer to raise a virtual hand like Jillian has, I'm happy to call on people. Jillian, would you like to share first?
Yes, sorry. I just want to, it's not so much a question, Amanda, as a reflection that I think you've really hit on two really important tensions here. I think worldviews always collide in co-creation, but the example you've given is just so compelling. And I think that that's a really, really helpful illustration, I think is one reflection. Most of my co-design work has been in youth mental health, where the worldviews of the youth can be extremely different than those of the family carers and the service providers. And one of the beauties of an effective co-creation process is when they come to understand each other. So, I think that one is hugely important. And the art and science, you're talking about that discomfort of moving into this zone. I think that's universal, and not knowing what the outcome is going to be, in my experience as well. And yet art brings, I think there's something in the being brought into a place of discomfort that allows the creativity to happen. Like once we can get past that, then we can start thinking outside of the box. But if we stay comfortable, we're not going to get there, perhaps, is my thought. So thanks.
Thanks, Jillian. Yeah, it was definitely uncomfortable at points, but a great learning experience.
Hannah? Oh, we can't hear you, Hannah. I'm not sure if your mic is connected for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Oh, I'm just too far. Okay, I'll come closer. Yeah, so not necessarily a question, but just a comment based off of the Clash of Civilizations. It was interesting to see how so many communities can come from different areas, but can have the same foundations in terms of like their thought processes of how to lead a family Like, for example, I come from a Jamaican background, and a lot of things that you have said have resonated with me because similar to how they use violence as a form of discipline, it's the same thing within my culture as well. And I found it very beneficial, the strategy you used of like, let's talk about this. Why do you do this? And dismantling that so you can get to the core reason of why they do it and kind of work with them to do things that don't have such a negative effect, but still yield the same results of like making sure that their kids grow up that the way they ideally would like them to in terms of like having discipline, respect, without having the negative aspects of it. So I resonated with that a lot in terms of just being able to work with them where they're at and be able to yield positive results.
Thanks so much for sharing, Hannah. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of the time with parenting programs, they come from, there's this assumption there, implicit or explicit, that there's a deficit, right? That parents have this deficit in either knowledge or skills, and that's why they're doing the things that they're doing or not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And instead, we, again, really wanted to come from this place of understanding and most importantly, empathy. Starting from a place of we understand and acknowledge that you want to do the best for your children, and let's help you figure out the best way to do that. And so that really kind of turned it on its head where, we were focusing on what parents wanted and how they felt, and also the impacts of using harsh discipline on themselves as parents. And that enabled us to really open up that space for dialogue.
Amanda, I had a question for you because I really appreciated your comments around the emergent iterative process that you used and how you had to trust other people who had knowledge and expertise. But and I appreciate that approach. That where I find it hard is when we put in ethics at the outset of a program that often request every little detail from how many sessions, how much time, number of people, where are you holding this event, what methods are you using? So it makes that emergent piece, I find, really challenging, as much as I'd like to say, well, you have to trust me because I'm trusting them and we're going to figure it out as we go. That it's a little tricky to make that fly.
Yeah, absolutely. And with ethics, it's funny because I've both had the experience of ethics committees saying to me, well, what you're proposing isn't research. Like what you're proposing as co-design is not research, so it doesn't need ethics approval. And I've had the opposite where they've said, well, you have to be more explicit and specific about what you're intending to do so that we can review and approve your study. And I think, again, it's the science of co-creation in quotation marks. Co-creation is still an emerging field. We're still figuring out, what does it look like? What does it mean? What is the science of it? And trying to figure that out alongside ethics committees, I think is an ongoing process. And trying to find allies, I think, within your ethics committee is really important. And having those discussions and also educating others around what is co-creation and why is it research and why does it not look like traditional academic research. Taking the time to also educate others about that helps with then ethics committees being a little bit more cognizant of why it doesn't why your application might not look like a more traditional application.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Maybe there's one other question that was raised in the chat before we move on to the next tension. So from Andrew, and it says, how do you pull apart worldview from lived realities like poverty, racism, etc.? Being marginalized and deeply disadvantaged feels different from being a worldview. How do you equitably navigate that difference?
Oh, wow. I love that perspective. And I agree it's not a worldview. I agree it's a lived reality. And it's a lived reality that in my own work, I try to acknowledge in everything that we do and that we co-create together. So again, kind of going back to the Parenting on the Border project, if you think back to the video that I showed, we worked really hard with families and communities to be able to depict their everyday lives in a way that was meaningful and real for them. As I mentioned, everything about that film was created by communities themselves. So they were the ones who came up with the stories. The people in it are regular community people filmed in the community. And we've had such a tremendous response showing this film in communities because people are watching their lives represented up on this big screen. And part of the reason too, we did that extensive qualitative research before the co-creation process was so that we could really make sure that whatever we co-created accurately depicts the lived experiences of families living on the border, the poverty, the discrimination that they experience, the insecurity that they experience, and how all of that permeates their everyday life and permeates how they can interact within their families. The stress of not having work, the stress of being undocumented, all of that affects parents, which in turn then affects the way that they can create positive relationships with their children. So I think for me, it's about making sure that we accurately depict those lived realities and again show empathy for how those stressors affect parenting and parent-child relationships, and then to help parents to find ways to cope with those stressors in ways that don't further harm themselves or children. So for example, using those kind of positive coping strategies. And that's sort of how we approach it, is to not ignore it, but instead explicitly acknowledge how those stressors and adversities affect families, and again, coming from that place of empathy.
Beautiful. Amanda, there is a question in the chat, but I actually wonder if it fits better with your tension number 2, I think, around time.
Sure.
I'll let you decide. So it's about how do you gain trust? Was it because you personally work there? How do you stay in contact or support these folks after the research is completed? And are participants paid? And how is that navigated? So I don't know if you'd prefer to chat about that now or if you want me to hold it till your next tension discussion.
Yeah, let's talk about it in the context of the next tension, because I do think it's really relevant. And thanks for all the questions, by the way. I love hearing everyone's thoughts. So this next tension I've called the ticking clock, decisions and trade-offs around time. And here I'm really going to be speaking a little bit more from the perspective of an early career researcher. And for those of you who are researchers, you'll be familiar with this idea of the tenure clock, which is something I only learned about after coming to academia. But basically, the idea of this tenure clock is that after you get your PhD and your first faculty position, that you have about 7 years to essentially prove yourself before you go up for promotion and then get tenure. And so right from the beginning of your career, you have this really ominous sense of this clock that's constantly ticking, that you have this limited amount of time to prove your worth. And thus, you have to be really strategic in how you use your time. And for an academic, traditionally, you prove yourself by producing certain types of outputs, outputs that can be quantified and that are visible. So most often, this would be publications, grants, and then for those who teach, it would also be, teaching, student evaluations, and so forth. So this idea of the ticking clock, you have to produce, and what you have to produce has to be visible, can be counted, can be cited, and so forth. Now, contrast this idea of the ticking clock with all of the work that is primarily invisible, the invisible work of relationship and trust building that is absolutely foundational to the work of co-creation. And I'll talk a little bit about my project here in Hamilton, Thriving Together, which I started very soon after moving to Hamilton and joining McMaster. And I was very aware that, you know, I was coming to Canada as a newcomer. I was new to Hamilton. I did not know the stakeholders. I did not know how the systems here worked. I had heard many times about community agencies being approached at the last minute by researchers to, you know, can you help us recruit some participants? And then they're never heard from again. No one ever comes back to present back findings or give feedback to the community agencies about what they learned from the research. And I was very adamant that I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to repeat those patterns. And so I spent a great deal of time first trying to build relationships, just trying to understand the system, who are the actors working within the system, what are their values and priorities, what are the dynamics between the different actors in that system. So I started this work, Thriving Together, in 2020, just starting out with really small grants, you know, slowly building and expanding on those grants to include more funders and more partners, and really working to build build trust within the community. And the way that I did that was essentially by just putting in the time and showing up. And I'll tell you, actually, the other day I was speaking with somebody from a community agency. We were at a meeting and she was introducing me, and she said, I've known Amanda now for a number of years because I kept running into her into all of the community events. Every time there was a community event about newcomers, about racialized communities, I would see Amanda there. And if I didn't see Amanda, I would get worried and I'd be like, oh, what's happened to Amanda? Is she okay? Why is she not here? And when I heard her introduce me this way, you know, it made me feel really happy because that is what I intended to do, was to put in the time, show up in the community, not only when I wanted something or when I needed something, but because I wanted to demonstrate that I was committed, I was there, I wanted to learn, and that I could be trusted. I could be trusted to show up. And so that meant, you know, joining community tables, for example. I'm part of several coordinating tables at the City of Hamilton, like the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, showing up at community events, also giving back. After doing research, I would then make a point of presenting back the findings to partner organizations. You know, for example, I partnered with YMCA on a study, and I made sure that I went back and I presented the findings to their field workers. Now, all of this time that's spent showing up to these events, presenting back to partners, unfortunately, none of this work gets counted. You know, none of this time that's spent, there are no concrete outputs. There's no publication, there's no grant, there's nothing that I can put on my CV that helps me along this, you know, this path towards career advancement. And so that is an inherent tension that I've had to navigate for myself as an individual, as a researcher doing this work in the community. And I've done this in a couple of different ways that I'll talk about briefly. One is that I've tried hard to find ways to make the work visible. So, for example, trying to do things that are not only useful for the community, but that I can also show. Creating videos, for example, of the work, putting on these events like the art exhibit I talked about, or other knowledge sharing events, creating infographics. These are things that community agencies value because no one has time to read a 10-page journal article that's written in academic jargon. But they like to have a 1-page or 2-page infographic that summarizes the findings of your work. And then I make sure that in every grant that I write, where there's an appendix, I put all those examples of those infographics, videos, events. I put them in there to show this is the work that I'm doing in the community. And this is work that I try to make visible by ensuring that I describe it when I write grants. And I think there is also some recognition and a shift in academia towards recognizing these kinds of contributions in the community as important. So some of you who are researchers may have heard that there's now a change in the Canadian Common CV. This is a CV that researchers have to use to apply for Tri-Council research funding. And now there's a shift towards making that a more narrative form of CV so that we are able to talk about and describe the kinds of contributions in the community that aren't your typical academic outputs. And there's also much more emphasis now on knowledge sharing, knowledge translation. So making the work visible and trying to find ways to do that is something that I've attempted to do in my own work. But I think for me too, more fundamental than that is I've had to also just change mindsets around time and, again, in quotation marks, productivity. In academia, there's this idea that you have to be productive as a researcher. And what that means, again, is producing research articles, getting grants. And I've had to wrestle with that and question how I feel about that. And thinking about, for me, coming to terms with the idea that for me, relationships and having those strong relationships is intrinsically valuable and important to me as a person and to me as a professional. Even if it doesn't lead to anything in the sense of leading to a grant, leading to a research publication, it is important in of itself. And I think I've had to come to terms with the fact that even if that's not valued because it's not visible and it's not a typical kind of academic output, that I'm going to do it because it's important to me and I believe it's important and it's important to the people around me. And so I think a lot of the way that I've had to navigate this tension is just coming to peace with the fact that I'm going to do it even if it's not valued specifically in these ways of academia, but that I find it important, and so I'm going to keep doing it. So I think that might address that earlier question of how do you build those relationships, and it is really just, as I said, about putting in the time and putting in the effort, yeah, I'll stop there actually and just see if there are any questions or reflections on this.
Yeah, I'll let Ollie determine if that question was answered. I think the one piece that was additional was the payment of participants and how you might have navigated that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's we always make sure that we compensate all of the people who are involved in all of our research. So all research participants, anyone participating in kind of community advisory groups, which we have for all of our projects, everyone who was involved in the co-creation process, they're all compensated for their time and contributions.
Yeah, thank you for that. There is an active chat going about this idea of parachuting in versus sustaining relationships in the community, but maybe I'll hold it for a sec. Oh, Ollie, did you want to respond? Because that was your question initially.
Yeah, thanks, folks. No, that basically answered what I was poking at, and like, I fully agree with the co-creation model. My other thing is about how, like, especially if like, talking about the structure of research and like specifically what was just mentioned in the chat, the parachuting model. How do we like? I am a firm believer of like when we do research, we should like reflect on our own positionality and where we best fit in and how to have those like biases that actually benefit us. I would say the research, because I fully believe that nobody is objective and have that knowledge. And so with the I guess my question is just around like with how do we like I love the co-creation, but is there also like parameters around who we co-create with because of our own backgrounds or experiences or our team's backgrounds and experiences? Thank you.
That's a great question, Ollie. And I'm so sorry we keep doing this to you, but I am actually going to talk about that in a later slide. So if you don't mind again, just waiting on that because I think it's such an important question. And I do want to come back to it.
Yeah. There was
Not a problem. Thank you so much.
There was one other, and keeping my eye on the clock here, raised by Roma, who was asking about the qualitative research component and whether that was also part of the co-design. Oh, sorry, no, I think I read it wrong. Was it also co-designed? For example, the interview guide. And do you see qualitative research or some pre-work as necessary before getting into the co-design?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would characterize all of this work as community engaged, meaning that from the very beginning, so from conceptualization all the way through to data collection, analysis, and then knowledge sharing, that we engage community at every step of the way. So for Thriving Together in Hamilton, and I do this in every project, we establish a community advisory group composed of service providers and newcomers. And together we work to develop the research questions, the methods for the research study. I invite feedback on interview guides and so forth. And then we brainstorm initial results and reflect on that, and they help with interpretation. And then we also work together on what are some strategies for sharing this knowledge with the wider community. So I think having, community engagement at every step of the way is incredibly important. And then in terms of the actual co-design of interventions, absolutely, I think having some qualitative work beforehand is extremely important to help then also inform the co-design process. And so for Thriving Together, we spent the last 4 years doing both quantitative and qualitative research to understand mental health needs among newcomer communities, as well as what are their preferences for types of mental health support they would like to receive. And 4 years later, now we're going to use all of those findings to actually co-design a mental health intervention. So it's a multi-staged process for sure.
Amazing. And maybe that brings us back around to Andrew's comment in the chat that it does take a lot longer, but used a metaphor of slow cooking. So it takes longer, but tastes better, which that's going to stick with me.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of time, maybe we will move into the third tension.
Sounds good. So this third tension, I try to think about, the outcomes and priorities that matter to community and to the academy. And, this is a broad generalization, but I try to kind of think about, well, for the community, what are their main priorities? And in the communities that I work with, especially, these are communities experiencing a lot of daily adversity like poverty, like housing challenges, like discrimination. So really the priority for many communities is around meeting needs, and also just meeting everyday needs, basic needs for survival, but also for dignity. The time horizon tends to be shorter. Community wants to obviously meet those needs now. They don't have time to wait. And the metrics for determining whether or not progress is being made is, are people getting served, right? Are people getting reached? Are they receiving better programs and services? Now, contrast that with then the outcomes that are meaningful to the academy or to researchers. And typically, the priority here is we are researchers, so advancing science, advancing scientific knowledge, building theory, building evidence. You're contributing to the field of knowledge. And then by virtue of that, the time horizon tends to be longer. You're working on papers that can sometimes take years to get published. You're thinking in terms of your contributions to the scientific field in decades potentially, right? Building a body of evidence over the length of your career. Not only your own contributions, but the contributions of your peers as well. And so here then the metrics are, what is the scientific impact that you're making? Again, often measured in terms of how much are other people using your work, right? How much are your ideas, your findings being used and influencing how other people think about these issues? So as someone who kind of works at this intersection between community and academy, I'm trying to find this sweet spot, right? This overlap between community and academy, and how can we expand that sweet spot? How can we make that overlap bigger? And some of the ways that I've done that is to try to identify what is a common need, so a community need that's also a gap in the scientific field, and that importantly, that I feel I'm well positioned to help address. So for example, in many of the communities that I work with, usually when I first start having conversations with communities, they are talking about basic needs for housing, for income support, needs that I can't really help with as a researcher. However, when we keep talking, they also start talking about how all of these unmet needs lead to a great deal of mental distress, and how there are these ripple effects of this mental distress, such as family conflict, family violence, and how there's a real lack of support for parents and families on how to cope with these stressors and how to help their children cope with these stressors. Now, that is also a gap in the scientific field. We have a lot of evidence on parenting and family strengthening programs that are effective, but we also know from research that most of those programs don't reach the families who need it the most, right? There's a real gap in terms of programs and services being able to reach families, right? There's a huge unmet need there. So the question then is, how can we create interventions that are effective for families, but can actually get to them and can reach as many families as possible at low cost and that are scalable? Especially because I, work in low income settings, low resource settings, where there are not very many mental health professionals. Having a very expensive 12-session parenting program that has to be delivered by a licensed psychologist isn't going to work. So here I try to find then this common need or question where the community has identified something that they require that isn't currently available. And in the scientific field, there is this question of how can we develop programs that are accessible and scalable for families living in adversity? And I am positioned to be able to help address that common question, especially because I have experience working in the field as an implementer and researcher in these communities. So alongside that, trying to also then find ways to address both community and academic priorities. So working to deliver, create and test interventions quickly so that we can get those interventions to communities so they can meet needs as quickly as possible, while at the same time working in the background as a longer term endeavor to think about how this contributes to the larger kind of scientific field and scientific community. So all of those, questions around conceptual models that I'm also really interested in, thinking about intergenerational transmission of trauma and adversity and trying to unpack those. Those are things that I recognize as a longer time horizon that I can keep working on in the background while I also fulfill my commitments to addressing community priorities around getting them evidence around programs and interventions that can work. The other thing that I've tried to do, and I think we can all do better as researchers, is how can we be more creative and think outside the box around using methods that can really shorten the time horizon. So, for example, with qualitative research, which we've talked a lot about and how important qualitative research is, we're trained as researchers to do qualitative research in a very specific way that honestly takes a huge amount of time and effort. And then often all of that time and effort means that it's not as possible to involve communities in that process, and it takes a very long time to get findings to then inform policies and programs. And so thinking about how can we use, for example, rapid qualitative analysis methods to shorten that time frame from data collection to actual informing of programs and services. That's something that I've been starting to delve into as well is, do we always have to do research in this one particular way that we've all been trained to do? Or are there ways that we can still do rigorous research, but do it in with an eye to informing programs and services more quickly so that we can shorten that time horizon to greater impact in the community? So those are some of the ways that I've tried to, align the priorities that sometimes seem very divergent between community and academy. And what I'm going to do actually now, before we move on to discussion, is I just wanted to wrap up with some kind of key takeaways in terms of what I've learned from this work, and then I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. But I think what you've all heard is this recurring theme of trying to find and build on common ground. And that is, really the main the takeaway from my work on co-creation over the years. And I'll just highlight a few key points. One of which is trying to find and focus on our commonalities, right? What makes us all similar rather than different. So in my work with newcomers here in Hamilton, for example, I start every talk, I start every meeting, every community gathering by saying, I'm a newcomer too. I only just arrived in Canada 5 years ago. I'm still learning all of these things too, even though I come from a very different position. I come from a place of privilege, but we have this common experience of being a newcomer to Canada. Similarly, like in my previous example with the project in Thailand, highlighting this commonality of we may come from different cultures, we speak different languages, we're very, very different in every possible way, but we all agree that every parent wants the best for their children. So highlighting those commonalities, and then again, being willing to listen, compromise, and take a leap of faith. This sounds easy to say, it's difficult to do in practice. And I think it's been a real test for me sometimes to really listen to very different points of view and disagree, but find ways to compromise, and again to trust the other actor, the partner, even when you might not know what the outcome would be. The other thing that I've learned is really important is to recognize that there is an inherent power imbalance in many co-creation processes and many partnerships. And that as academics coming into a community, often we hold a position of power. We're often coming with the funding. We're coming with the fancy letters behind our name. We're coming with, this sort of, we know the science. And so that trumps everything else. And I think what I've tried to do in a lot of my work is to shift the balance of power. And I do that in different ways, but one way I do that is by, again, listening, but also trying wherever I can to let the partners make the decision. And that if there is something that we might disagree on, if I might prefer a different approach, wherever possible, I try and let them make the final call. Even if I disagree, even if I would have done it differently, wherever possible, I try and have them make the final call to put my money where my mouth is and say, you're the ones in power here. I'm going to demonstrate to you in big decisions and small decisions that you have the power to make those calls. Having said that, I think it is really important, and this goes back to what Ollie's question was, around knowing each other's non-negotiables. There are certain non-negotiables that I think every partner stakeholder group would have. I have my own, and I'm sure all of my partners have their own as well. And really articulating what those non-negotiables are as soon as possible so that you can figure out whether or not this is a partnership and co-creation process that can work is really important. So for example, I've explored partnerships before where, they were, the partner was very much not open to having an evaluation design that would include a control group or a comparison group. So a group that would not receive the intervention, so that we could compare their outcomes with the group that did receive the intervention or program. Now, as a researcher who often conducts evaluations with a comparison group, for me, that's an example of a non-negotiable. And so if we can't come to agreement around that, that could be a partnership that's not going to work out. And I think there can be lots of other examples of these non-negotiables, and it's okay if you can't come to agreement, but knowing from the beginning as much as possible what those non-negotiables are is really important. And then, focusing on what brings us together. Again, what is that common vision and mission that brings us together, that can act as our guiding light so that even if we have disagreements along the way, we're all united around our common goal. And then finally, just deciding what trade-offs you're willing to make. And this is very much a personal decision. I've talked a bit about trade-offs that I've decided that I want to make because I believe they're intrinsically important. And I think for each of us, especially for researchers working in this area, it's important for you all to decide too what trade-offs you're willing to make and accept and be happy with those trade-offs. So with that, I'll just also wanted to just acknowledge and express my gratitude to all of our funders, partners, team, and all of the families who co-created with us. And you can see here all of the different logos. You can see that I've worked with many different partners on our various projects, and they've all been wonderful, and this work would not be possible without them. So thank you so much for listening, and really happy to continue the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you, Amanda. So we might just have a couple of minutes because I know that there's questions being asked in the chat also about the SSHRC Partnership Grant that was introduced at the beginning. So if I can save a minute or two for that, I will. But for you, Amanda, there was a question asked, I think in response to your comments on rapid qualitative analysis, whether or not there might be a place for AI to help with community research analysis. You know, do you have thoughts?
That is a good question, and one that I am absolutely not equipped to answer because I'm definitely not on top of the whole AI revolution. So I really don't know. I don't know if anyone else has any experience doing AI. I think what I find exciting about the rapid qualitative analysis is not only the kind of shortening that time horizon, but also it just opens up more opportunities for partners and community members to be involved. And so there's a project that I have in Hamilton on youth experiences of violence and discrimination, and the project is entirely youth-led. We have a group of youth peer researchers working with us, and learning more about these rapid qualitative analysis approaches makes me realize that we can democratize that data analysis process much more, and then really involve the youth peer researchers in a more substantive and meaningful way, that doesn't involve, expensive qualitative analysis softwares and hundreds of hours of transcription and coding. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any experience with AI.
I'm thinking it might be a large topic for the last minute or two we've got here. So maybe a lower hanging fruit question might be if you have any resources or on rapid qualitative analysis. Sorry, the chat is moving as I try to read this question. Or mixed methods approaches, either from within your own body of work or resources that you've drawn from. And Rachel's already provided some links in the chat in response to you, Jillian. So thanks for that, Rachel. And Amanda, if there's any others that you think are key go-to resources, we can even share them with participants post call if you want a chance to look for links or citations or anything.
Yeah, I've put a name in the chat, Alison Hamilton. If you look up her work, she has some webinars as well that are recorded that you can find online. I found her work really helpful.
Amazing. And I know we have a bit of wrap up to do from our team, but Ollie, would you like the last question?
Thank you so much, folks. Yeah, I have one question, and it might be a little bit bigger of a topic too, but my last question would be with co-creation around like ownership and access to this data and creation, because like something with like not-for-profits, you're able to like I would guess like the folks who made the video in Thailand and Myanmar might have more access to that, but then like stuff within the university and the ownership around what we create, how because I know with like OCAP principles or EGAP principles for Indigenous and Black communities, but thinking also about like the communities you work with, Amanda, just what is like the structure of ownership, access, and data stewardship, if there is any.
Yeah, great question. So we've tried to take as much as possible a pretty open approach to the use of data. I'll take the example of the Thailand project. We have a huge team there from, I think, 4 different countries working on that project. And we've always been very open from the outset that this data is for the use of service providers, of academics, of students. We want people to use this data. And so we have developed processes for folks to be able to access that data. We also obviously, have certain safeguards in place. We make it clear that the data is only to be used for research purposes because it is quite a sensitive population. Making sure that we're safeguarding confidentiality, and that also that the data is not used in ways that could endanger communities, many of whom are undocumented. So we have put in processes to safeguard not just participants, but also just that the data isn't being used to support findings or messages that would be counter what we're trying to achieve and what we, the best interests of the communities. So I think it's a balance of having those processes in place and making sure that they're communicated from the outset and everyone agrees with them, but also putting in those safeguards to make sure that the data is being used in a way that's positive and ultimately in the best interests of the community.
Thank you, Amanda. I know thanks have started to come in via the chat for such an incredible presentation. It was obviously very thought-provoking and engaging, and I'm mesmerized by your work. So I hope we can connect at some future point. I maybe will turn it back to Sanat. I know we had a couple of wrap-up slides, and for people who are wondering about the SSHRC Partnership Grant, if you link to the form and tell us that you're interested in learning more, you're not signing up to say, yes, you're on board, you're joining. It's really just an expression of interest at this time. We're happy to send you a one-pager where you can learn a little bit more about what these initial plans are and how you can participate further if you desire.
Yes, and some, I guess, concluding comments. If you would like to join our newsletter to stay up to date on all of our amazing opportunities and upcoming EQCC dialogues, such as this one, please consider signing up using this QR code and the link that I've put in the chat. And of course, we would love to hear your feedback on the discussion today. So please go to this link and share that so that we can read them. And if you have any suggestions for what could be improved for the future, incorporate that moving forward. So that is all. I guess that brings us to the end. Michelle, would you like to conclude? Thank you,
I'll
everybody.
just say thanks to everybody for joining. I started with some reflection about community and community action. And Amanda, you've done that so beautifully with your own communities and research partners, but also we think of this group as a community. So it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and also a growing community. So welcome to anyone who's here for the first time, and we hope to see you again.
Bye, everybody.
I'm just reading through all the messages.
Do you want to stop the recording here, Sanat?